Hi, welcome to Are We Sharing Too Much? Another one of the Solve Talks at Google. What we've been trying to do in the previous Solve Talks, and we'll do throughout the winter and the spring, is ask really tough and really thorny questions, but questions that matter a lot to us and that are about the future, how we're going to live. This is being streamed live on YouTube, so hi to everybody both in the room and people who are watching out there. And I want to thank, before we get started tonight, the people at Google and at MIT Tech Review and at Solve at MIT who helped put this together. I want to thank our great panelists, Robin Chase, who founded Zipcar, author of Peers Inc., who literally traveled halfway around the world to be here. So yeah, you can't put much more effort in than that.
Even though I lived blocks away.
Even though, yes, just back from Beijing. And Karim Lakhani, who is a real expert on sharing, on collaboration economy at Harvard Business School. So thanks to you very much for being here, and thanks to you for coming. And the way we'll do it is we'll talk for about half an hour, and then we'll do about 20 minutes of your questions, and there are microphones in the aisles. So you all know, you've all seen this sort of rise of the sharing economy. We were talking about Uber right before we sat down, Lyft. We see the sharing of all sorts of other things, rooms with Airbnb. We see the sharing of physical things. Obviously, Netflix sends around DVDs, but we also see the sharing of music. And think about Pandora, but in not such a physical form. So I want to think about where this is going, what are the ramifications, what does it do to jobs, what does it do to social networks, what does it do to businesses? And Robin, I'm going to ask the first question of you, which is, what kind of change have you seen in the last few years in the sharing economy? And I know some people think about it as sharing, some people think about it as more collaborative. Tell me essentially what you've seen happen, sort of bring us up to now. What have you seen happen over the last few years, and how do you define it?
If I think about when I started Zipcar 15 years ago, which is a long time ago now, I didn't want to use that word sharing because it had really negative undertones. So it was going to be crummy, kind of 1960s, hippie-ish. And I think Facebook kind of transformed that word as a start also. Today, which is why you asked this question, I think the word, when people talk about the sharing economy, they are using it in a very narrow sense that what you kind of elaborated past that sense. So I don't really like the term sharing economy because it makes it people think that it's peer-to-peer and physical assets. But what I see happening is, thanks to the internet, which was kind of my epiphany when I thought about Zipcar, was the internet makes sharing very specific small things, zero transaction costs, and makes finding those things simple. And so that means that we can share a much larger group of things like data and devices and physical assets and networks and experiences. So my thesis as I look over these last 15 years is I would bind together Uber and Airbnb, which everyone does, but I would push Facebook and YouTube and Pandora and massive online open courses all into that same box. And what we're seeing is everything that can become a platform is becoming a platform, and it's the larger entity that's bringing to it all the important, expensive, hard-to-do things onto the platform, and leaving to the outside of the company all the diversity and, as I think of localization and specialization. These platforms are harnessing excess capacity every time. So what we're seeing, to be clear, is I think this is Peers Inc. collaboration, the platforms harnessing and leveraging excess capacity and inviting the participation of outsiders to pull the net closed. And each one of these things is that. And if we don't recognize that we're leveraging excess capacity, I think people are missing half of the value and why these things are so successful. So why did Uber grow so incredibly fast? Because I didn't have to buy a car to do it, right? I could try it out right here and now. Now people are buying cars, but they certainly were not doing that to begin with. So it's how it can grow so quickly and localize so quickly, because we have this excess capacity, outside participants, and the platform that makes it so simple and easy to to bind together.
And the same with Airbnb. I mean, I feel like originally it was people with a spare room, and it's still kind of people with a spare room, but you also have like bigger sort of, Airbnb mini moguls in little, in different cities buying studio apartments just for that purpose.
Right, so just I just want to give one more example since we just went straight back to the physical part.
Yeah.
I would say every smartphones and apps are what I think of as a peers Inc. So the smartphone is a platform for participation, way harder to build, to manufacture, to design than the apps, which are much lighter, take much less skill to do, and through that we're seeing what the diversity of offering is possible over the last 6 years since smartphones were invented. We've seen over 2 million different apps created. And when I was in Beijing, there was this great sentence that I loved. That actually, so it was on a TV show, and the anchor asked the audience, who here is willing to share their smartphone, and not just share like make a phone call, but share like you can have it for a couple hours and bring it back. And of course, everyone said, no, I'd share all the other things, but not my smartphone. Then I realized, and then I asked, so has anyone downloaded an app onto their smartphone? And every single app you're downloading, you are sharing your phone. You're sharing your phone with that company. You're sharing your whereabouts. You're sharing your data. And that's what I mean. It's completely pervasive into every way we approach business now, is we have this interaction of, it's so melded that we don't even appreciate the fact. But if we went back 20 years, you would never let companies in so close to your life, or companies to collaborate among themselves even. But so it's now really enmeshed.
Karim, how do you see the economy changing? It feels like when we think about these businesses, from Uber to something like Pandora, that it's a major transformation, but maybe it's bigger or smaller than we think it is.
Yeah, so I think it's worth thinking through the fact that we've been sharing all the time as humans. So if you think about the commons, right, the grazing commons for sheep or for cattle, that was a shared space where farmers got together and they created rules and governance on how to share commons. And we've had, legacy historical precedents of how to share commons, and we've figured that out. And so I think the distinction that Robin has made, I think, is very useful. There's sharing of assets, which we've had historically happen, and also sharing of knowledge. Like we've always been sharing knowledge, and that there's also great historical precedents of how sharing of knowledge made immense breakthroughs in the Industrial Revolution and so on. So I think that there's nothing new in that sense. Like this has been going on. What's new is the scale, and the fact that we can now do it in so many different ways, and it's very easy for us to take an asset and make it shareable and tie it into networks, and to then utilize it to its maximum capacity, and to sort of use this excess capacity that comes through. So I started looking at this, when I was doing graduate studies, about sharing of knowledge in terms of the rise of open source communities. And again, people didn't think that would be viable at all. One of the beneficiaries of open source has been this company here, Google. But that methodology and that approach really transformed the ways in which we thought about software development, and we thought about the ways in which companies need to work together. So in the knowledge side, I think open source has really shown how you actually go and share knowledge. And this can be both individuals or companies and even competitors sharing knowledge back and forth. I think what's new is the scale by which we can take things like a car, like an apartment, or other goods, and make them quote unquote shareable. And I think the challenge for us is to say, what are the limits to that, and what does that do to our sort of economic growth and productivity? And is this a world in which basically the platforms win and everybody else loses, right? Or in fact, will there be equitable distribution in that setting?
I want to add one piece to that I didn't neglect to say, and you also, your work does this, is that the platforms also give the power of the large to the small. So why is the Airbnb person able to do this? Because Airbnb has done the grand marketing, the fancy app, the great communications, and so that's one of the empowering parts of this. But yeah, I think there's a dark side absolutely as well. So as we go down this discussion, we can talk about up and down.
So before we talk about that dark side, I wonder, we've rattled off a list of companies. What do you see as next? Maybe something we don't share right now, either something physical or not physical, that you think in the next few years, this is sort of in the next wave of sharing companies?
Well, things that we're talking about that are just imminent is when I think of smart homes and smart cities and distributed energy, all things dear to my heart, that is all on this basis of this collaborative sharing of what's happening where. Something big is doing the analysis of all this big data and sending it out to the small parts to empower them. So that will be, I think, a significant transformation in how we all move through our world. And again, it is, for me, this new collaborative economy, because the parts are fitting together very tightly. Things that I'm also surprised about that I think we'll be seeing shortly is how a transformation of the banking industry, I think, is because they are making so much money, and so it's an incredible target. And the blockchain and things like that are going to, the empowerment of small actors now is going to be able to rip away, I think, a huge amount of their gains.
Really, you think they're going to be able to break up?
I have a number of friends who are building startups that are trying to take down the financial sector. Yes. Yeah.
That's interesting because, as you say, I mean, when you go, if anybody's ever had the experience of getting out a mortgage, they give you a piece of paper and they say,
it's the stack.
Well, yeah, well, okay, this is just one of the stack that I'm talking about. Yes, indeed, they give you a stack. But this piece of paper, I think my agent actually said to me, like, don't be concerned now, because it was how much you're going to have to pay back, but throughout the life of the loan. It is the scariest thing. It's very often more than double what the loan is that you're taking out, and it's a frightening thing. So it will be very interesting if that power can be changed or broken up.
To a smaller example, that startup that I met in Silicon Valley about 6 months ago, and I thought it was fantastic. It was, and luckily I can't remember its name. So, but they were doing remittances, so it's not TransferWise that's doing, I'd say, peer-to-peer currency transaction. This was using the smartphone for me to say, Karim's my local ATM. As a human, so making human ATMs across the world. So I go to Karim and I give him $200. He puts it into his smartphone. Robin gave me $200, and then my friend in the Philippines is going to go to the human ATM near her and say, "Open up my account and give me that $200, and I'll give you $1.50 for that." And I thought, wow. Like that is.
But we've had that before, like the Havala system in South Asia and the Middle East was based on that, right? You give money to one person, and we can withdraw the money from somebody else, completely unconnected in that kind of a sense. But now we can do this at scale. So, to your question, I mean, I teach a course on digital innovation and transformation, and the basic thesis is that more and more of the world's transactions and processes are being digitized. So anything you can stick a microprocessor in, you can create data from, connect to the network, is now becoming available to be put on platforms. Mm-hmm. And what that does, it changes value creation in terms of how value is being generated for the customers. It changes value capture, like how companies make money, and then it fundamentally affects your operating model. It changes the way in which companies actually operate as well. And I think that transition, where it's just what started in the tech sector, is now we're seeing in banking, in insurance, in financial services writ large, but also in healthcare, right? Also in sports. So that is a secular trend, and as more and more things get digitized and get put online, the things we see about Uber or about Airbnb, we're now going to see other things like that emerge as well.
Well, one of the things you look at is companies, in some ways, sharing their problems. Like, we have this problem, we're trying to solve it. We know you're smart out there. Help us come up with these answers. And I wonder if you think that's increasingly what companies, which historically have been private and said, we have information and knowledge, and we do not let that out the door, because if you knew what we were trying to develop, then wouldn't you do it yourself, kind of thing. But I also wonder if it's asymmetrical. I was talking to somebody recently who works at a college, and they were saying, well, companies will come now and they'll have like codeathons and they'll say, work on this problem. And then if you do a really good job, we'll consider interviewing you. So they're like solving their problem, they're solving their problems for free.
Yeah.
And then, they might get something in return, maybe, but it's not guaranteed.
Yeah, yeah. And I think again, there's a cost benefit analysis that the participant is making, right? So we find in our research when we look at crowdsourcing is people are participating because it's fun, it's enjoyable, they get to self-select under the problem, they actually, might get some other sort of extrinsic benefits for it. For the company, it's like now I get 1,000 people working on my problem and maybe we can achieve a breakthrough. So there is this sort of, and I think again what you see is like that there's both this empowerment that some kid in Estonia will solve your problem, and we've had in my lab, we've done a bunch of work with NASA and with the Harvard Medical School and with Scripps Research. And in fact, that's what happens. We find the non-obvious people
come from Estonia.
Exactly, right, or China or elsewhere. But it's the people that are not experts in the fields of the problems that solve these very tough algorithmic computational problems. But it's the fact that we can now these platforms. The great side about these platforms is it allows us to connect the quote-unquote little guy into the big behemoth companies and organizations or the elite institutions that typically are very hard to access for a variety of reasons. I think that's the great part about it.
And one of the things that we've been talking and haven't said overtly is that I feel like I have a little yin-yang picture. I feel like each side, it's very symbiotic, and if the platform by itself without the participants is nothing. What's a hackathon without people? And those guys won't participate if there's not enough value for them, and the company won't create it if they're not going to get some value. So it really is this value sharing. But one of the interesting things that you mentioned about I want to push you a little bit on this. Idea generation is interesting, but is certainly not the full end value product. So maybe 6 years ago, there were all these apps for and all these hackathons, and I would watch these, friends of mine would say, for $50,000, DC did Apps for Democracy and generated 253 apps in 48 hours, and it was all these numbers. How many of those succeeded after another year or 2 years? So there's a lot more to it. So it's really good for idea generation in those particular examples, but it does not build a business model or a company that's sustainable. So there are different parts of that equation.
So let's talk about some of the sharing and collaboration that has caught on. And we sort of alluded to this before, but certainly at the upper levels, I assume, of Uber and Airbnb, there's a lot of money being made, and even more money that will be made when all these companies decide to go public. But I don't...
Or not.
Or stay private forever.
Or lose money as well. I mean,
yes, that's
also,
there's
right?
A lot of platforms fail, and we
Yes.
just don't talk about them. In fact, most fail.
Right. But we certainly know there are a lot of people who are Uber drivers, who are using, who are renting out their spare room using Airbnb, who are making nowhere near that kind of money. Does it concern you that there's such a big gap? Is it unfair? Is it working pretty much as it should? I mean, give me a sense of.
So I think the issue with when you have these platform-based models is that the platform itself has all the information about supply and demand, and they can literally squeeze out all the profits for themselves, right? And so they can basically take they can soak up all the profits for themselves. And that's the temptation that companies can't get around.
Is that happening?
Well, I mean, we have an example of what happened with the Microsoft ecosystem in the 90s, right? Microsoft came in and was one of the first platform companies, and then they just could not help themselves from forward integrating with all the other, who remembers Disk Doubler? Right? If you remember Disk Doubler, that was the thing with DOS that you would need, and there was a company that made that, and then the platform couldn't help it, but actually make that a feature and kill that business off. And so the temptation always is going to be to capture all the profits and soak it up. But I think the lessons we're learning is that platforms need to actually share equitably across both sides, both with customers as well as with the suppliers. And this equitable sharing is what I think that we haven't yet figured out yet, both economically, but also like just ethically. Like when you're running a platform, you need to think about the ethics of the fact that you have both sides of the market that you're serving, and you're playing this role of you have to actually play a governance role. and companies haven't thought of themselves as governance structures. They're thinking of themselves primarily as top-down dictatorial systems. And I think that's the new frontier for us to figure out.
So Karim talked about how we've had commons for a long, long time. And Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work on the non-tragedy of the commons, examples where commons did not fail. And I think her work is 100% applicable here, that these platforms are in fact commons, and they're called common pooled resources. And she came up with 8 principles of long-lived common pool resources. So here's the things you have to do if you want to have a long-lived one. And I think they're all directly applicable to these new collaborations. And basically, we have to push power out to those peers, as I think of them, and the peers need to create their own rules of engagement. They have to weigh in on the rules of engagement. But what we're seeing in capitalism today is, I don't care if I live for 10 years. I don't care if I live for 6 years. I only care if I live between now and when I go public, and then it's out. Really, you really only care till the next person up buys, and so
till you cash out.
Till you cash out, and so I think profoundly, if you look at the long term, you definitely want to keep those people engaged and to show the value, otherwise they won't participate. So I think we're in this early stage, and we do have all these pressures for them not to care. And one more piece around value creation. This was one way of looking at it. Another way, I think, is that there's 3 sources of value creation on these. One is the platform building, which is very high risk, costs a fortune. They deserve a lot for doing that. And then, as we said, the peers, each time they interact, they're getting value, otherwise they wouldn't participate. But the third piece is this network effect that's created by each of the individual peers as a group, but the platform is taking that whole value. The platform is getting every other piece of value except for what the individual's doing during transactions. But in fact, the individuals are huge creators in this larger value. So how to get them back that, I haven't figured out.
Does that mean we're entering into an economy with more consolidation of power? So, for example, Airbnb has a lot more rooms available than any hotel chain, but there's many hotel chains that compete against each other. They have different CEOs. They have people who manage, middle managers. Then each hotel that you would go to would have people managing that hotel. So there's a lot of people in hotels that are sort of somewhere at the top or in the middle making a decent living. I don't know, maybe a lot of people are making a decent living off of Airbnb, but it seems like it's a more centralized structure. And it has, boy, an awful lot of hotel rooms out there. And I wonder if we are moving towards a sort of more consolidation of power as the economy changes.
So I think it's still early days for Airbnb. I think the company's been around for 8 years. If you think about hotels, centuries, right? Inns have been around for long periods of time. So I think we're still early days. I think the way I would think about this is to say, does the network itself, is it a winner-take-all network or not, right? I think that's the question to have. In the PC world, it looked like standardization, right, and a little bit of some hacks by the companies could create winner-take-all markets. I'm not sure if Uber is in a winner-take-all market, right? Lyft is a competitor. It's easy for us to multi-home. Could be on Uber, it could be on Lyft. Yes, there's marketing budgets and so forth for us to do, but I'm not convinced that that Uber's ever going to be a winner-take-all kind of a business at all. They could muscle their way through for a while and kill their competitors, but the likelihood of somebody else emerging once they see the profits and the fact that you can multi-home will be high. Similarly, I think with Airbnb, again, what's happening with Airbnb is that those are 2 different business models are competing, right? Starwood and Marriott is about operating the hotels, right, and running the service this way, versus Airbnb saying it's about the renting the bed
but it's also fairly distributed. So
when
you're talking about the centralized power, I think the platform's centralized, but each one of those individuals is very decentralized. It's a totally different thing to run. Like, you can hire and fire your Starwood managers, but these guys, it's a lot harder.
So is the money more centralized? Maybe that's a better question.
So I think it could or couldn't be, because I think the platforms, the question for me is, are the platforms going to be owned by one entity that's taking all of that? But the peers, if Airbnb does what it's doing now, it has its superhosts. It has, I don't know, 20,000 superhosts. And they ask them, every time they make a move, they ask them, like, what do you think of this? How should we do it? Because they want to keep them happy. Yeah. So they are distributing power, and those guys are making money. When Airbnb gets sold or goes public, will they be getting the right amount of money from that whole thing? Probably not. But I think we can see these platforms that are shedding power and sharing power and sharing some wealth is an adequate amount or not. But I think we could go farther still and say, do we want the platforms themselves to ever be owned by one? And wouldn't it be nice to have distributively? I was at a conference around co-ops, and I actually am not holding. It costs too much money, I think, to build platforms, to actually think of them as real cooperatives. But they could be built in a distributed way, like free and open source software is. So can we imagine more platforms that are distributedly and collaboratively built? So that's another way.
We've yet to see one. Right now, it's been private investments that create these platforms.
Except for the free and open source movement.
That's right. Yes. Exactly. Where again, the cost to organize was almost zero because you had the internet infrastructure to make it happen, and you could be highly modular. So I think look, I think there is this sort of like, where are the profit pools going to move to? And profit creates jobs and creates wealth and so on. And the question is, if the Starwood manager is going to be fired, right? And if the restaurants inside of Starwood are going to be fired and so forth, but the need to still organize, the need to get a restaurant meal is still going to exist, right? And that will just be delivered in a different way. And I think part of the battle we're seeing right now is a battle around efficiency, right? Like the reason why we choose Uber or Lyft, right, over taxis is it's more efficient, easier for us to access, and then Uber makes a ton of money of it, and the drivers make some money of it. And I think this is gonna still work itself out, like, because I think that it's gonna force other taxi companies potentially to be more efficient. Although you look at them and you go, I don't know if that'll ever happen.
When you say there's two types of efficiency when you're saying that. There's efficiency of the transaction, which is what Uber and Lyft have definitely done. Yeah. But in addition, Uber and Lyft were using efficiency of the asset.
Yes.
Because they were repurposing this existing asset. So it was a different kind of efficiency going on.
Absolutely. And I think and this is back to the access capacity story, which is that if in fact your car right now is sitting on its parking spot for 95% of the time, right, is that the best way for us to be thinking about making these assets and selling these assets and using these assets? And that's I think what the very interesting questions this is raising is in fact, if we get better utilization of assets, but our economy is built around creating excess capacity, that's what we're based upon, but we can now don't need that excess capacity, that's going to raise interesting questions for us.
And it's also interesting, we've been talking, again, physical assets, but your work is largely also the excess capacity of human assets. Yes. No matter how many smart people there are here, there are more smart people outside of this room. And now the internet makes us able to reach and touch those networked people. Mm-hmm. So that's the other reason why these companies are being restructured, because the assets that are shared are used. Shared assets produce more value than closed proprietary ones, and shared minds are smarter and more innovative and more passionate and more local than a few inside your company. And those are just true. And so now that we have the internet and we're connected, companies will shape themselves to deliver the best value and to get to the best minds.
But I tell you, it's tough. This is not like telling my colleagues at NASA, right? Like some kid in Estonia is going to have a better algorithm than they have at JSC at Houston. It's like, no friggin' way. Like that can't be possible. And I think the question is really, will these be substitutes or will they be complements to existing companies, especially around the knowledge sharing asset?
Well, so we're in this transition, exactly. So you have been proving these proof points, and they say, no way, we're smarter inside. Then they'll do a challenge and say, wow, this guy you never thought of from who knows where came up with these solutions.
Yeah.
I wonder if, to some degree, I want to take your questions in just a couple minutes, so be thinking of them, and you can feel free to line up behind the microphones if you've got a couple of questions. But I wonder if there's a generational shift in values at all. There's a famous study, I think it was actually commissioned by Zipcar, but that looked at what young people value. And a tremendous amount of young people, I think it was something like close to 50%, said they would rather essentially hold on to their smartphone than hold on. Like a phone was more important to them than a car. And you talk to a lot of people, let's say, who came of age in the 50s and 60s.
Duh. No.
Well, yeah, but
Now,
I mean, it used to be like the dream when
Yes.
you were 16, 17, 18 to get a car. I mean, that was the greatest thing. So the fact that people are prioritizing a point of connection, I mean, this is a thing, but it's mostly a connection.
Yes.
But the fact that people are prioritizing that over the physical, I wonder if that says anything to you about the customer in some ways changing.
Yeah, I mean, cars are kind of funny, because I think at least in America, it's like this identity around the car. So like all my cousins had, Lamborghini posters when they were growing up, in their rooms and so forth. And I mean, I think like the car was the source of identity, and I'm not sure if that. I mean, they still want to sell you that, but I'm not sure if that's what people are thinking about that in terms of cars. And I think the device in your hand, the mobile phone, is so multi-purpose, right? Because it's a productivity tool, it's a social tool, it's a communication tool. So that's why people are saying it's all bundled into one thing. And so I think the comparison doesn't make sense because one was a source of identity, and now there's multiple sources of identity that we are now dealing with that companies are providing us in interesting ways. And I think so why are we so glued to Facebook, and why am I counting all the likes I get on the photos I post? Is because there's some basic neurological function going on that's sort of making rewards, and that's way better than driving a fast car in Cambridge traffic, right?
The other piece, I want to add one piece to that, and I think Zipcar did make a transition, as we saw in other sectors, that the reason we own things is because that was the only way we could assure that we had access.
Yes.
And so Zipcar showed you don't have to own the car to be able to have it when you want it. And we see that now with music, and we see that with other things. And so I think the smartphone or technology, when I learned it with cars, and I learned it with music, and I learned it with getting a taxi, I now am continually being reinforced. I don't have to own something to have it full access to it when I want it. And so when we think about the generational piece, I would say, I don't really think it is completely generational, but when those old people experience it, they also start sliding down the curve. I mean, it's just a call and response. I experience it, and I recognize it, and I feel more comfort, and so that I go to the next type of asset. So I think we've all been trained that don't worry about it. You can go get whatever you want in a few seconds.
And you think it's a change for good? It's not like millennials get older and want what people wanted generations before,
No.
just because they are going to be 42, at some point.
No.
No. Okay. We've got a question here.
So you brought up the idea of efficiency between Uber and the taxi industry, and you said you don't know if the taxi industry will ever be as efficient. I want to bring up the consideration of regulations. So when we look at stuff like Uber, Airbnb, they're not currently facing the same tight regulations that these established entities have to face. So with the taxi industry, we see throughout Europe, we see within our own country, lots of protests because taxis have to be so safe, they have to have so many carbon emissions, the drivers, medallions. In whole countries, like India, it's been banned from sexual assault. We've seen in our country, there are drivers who have criminal histories. And then even with Airbnb, there's the same questions that they don't have to meet the hotel parameters. So how does that play into this idea of regulations, safety, public health? And then how are incumbents who have to face these regulations, how are they dealing with it? So for example, if Zipcar, Avis ended up acquiring Zipcar to be like, hey, here's a competitor, if we take them under our wing, it would be easier.
It's a great question, and it's interesting you talked about Airbnb and hotel regulations, because we have talked before about hotels saying, well, it's not fair that you don't have to have sprinkler systems, for example, and but the structure, the way that hotels are built is very different from the way that private homes with an extra third bedroom.
I would say there's three levels of approach to the safety and problem. One is at a government level. the government has decided that all buildings should be fire resistant and not collapse under certain circumstances. And so my 3-year-old can sleep there and it's great. And a person can rent my house and sleep there, and it does that. The second is at the platform level, they can impose another cut. So in theory, every Uber driver in the US should have a background driving check, just like Zipcar did for each one of theirs. And whether they do another criminal one, I don't know, but they could.
Like we do for guns.
Like we do, yeah, just exactly. They could and should. So I'd say for Zipcar, I was definitely doing that because my insurance relied on it. And then the third level is, if I think about the taxis, I was certified as a taxi driver 3 years ago, but since then I've become an alcoholic drug addict and I'm a really terrible driver. But with Uber or Lyft, each time a person gets in that car, they're rating it in real time. So I see these 3 levels of argument, and then around safety issues. And then just a couple of things that you mentioned in addition. I'm very fact-based, and when people tell me, yeah, did you hear about that Uber driver that raped that woman? I think, okay, I would like to know what are the statistics for taxi drivers raping women. And I am completely convinced that there's not going to be a greater incidence of one over the other at all. So anyway, I feel like regulation has to happen at the appropriate level and should not be double counted. So my car is safe to drive, have to get it inspected every 6 months. No one should be driving unsafe cars, period. So it's, where does it come in? And then actually I have to say one more thing on this regulation. When you look at the regulations, we need to be very specific. And I refuse to answer a yes or no. So we have 3 types of rules. Regulations that are addressing public safety and goods, and I am really behind those. I did not launch my peer-to-peer car sharing company in this country for 5 years because I couldn't get insurance. So I am completely there around the safety issues. But there are some rules that are stupid and don't make any sense anymore. So you couldn't use GPS. GPS was not an approved device to measure distance in 2012 in New York City. The only approved device was the one that the Tax and Licensing Commission had approved, which was not GPS. So there's rules that are stupid. And there's a whole bunch of rules that are only done to protect the incumbents. And they're not protecting the public good. And I feel like that is what's really hit those taxi drivers. Like in London, people had to spend 3 years studying the knowledge. Yet we have GPS. So when you're revolting, you should be revolting some of the times. You should be revolting against your licensing commission that's held inane rules that don't make any sense.
Yeah, I think, just to add, I mean, I think look, the regulations impose a cost on all businesses. And there's a sane reasons why regulations exist, but oftentimes they're frozen in time for a certain era. What happens is that the incumbents do regulatory capture, right? So the taxi industry are in bed with licensing commissions and with medallions, right? Like I was in Vancouver. Vancouver has no bike sharing or Uber, right, or car sharing. And I tweeted that out, and I said, it looks like the medallions have captured the regulators, and then I got all this nasty stuff back from those guys. But it's true, right? The incumbents have very little incentive to change, and the regulators are captured by them. We saw the same thing in the banking industry as well, and so forth. So the question Robin is raising is, are the regulations appropriate for the era that we live in, or are we living in the world of medallions from the 1930s and 40s and so forth? The second thing is that yes, we of course need to update and think about the right regulatory burden on these platforms. I mean, I think that's and I think if the platforms were smart, they would say, yes, let's figure out what the right regulatory structure is, right, and it should be applied equally to everybody else as well. So I think what's happening is that we're in this very interesting, and for a scholar it's great, very interesting time of transition where all these things are coming to a head, and there's different competing interests in terms of who will actually turn over. And the fact that some cities have embraced Uber and some have said no way tells you that these battles are still to be figured out.
If there's another question, feel free to step up to the mic. In the meantime, Robin, another question about the government, a very different kind of question, not about regulation, but if more and more people are sort of collaborating and sharing, but in a somewhat informal way where they're not an employee of Marriott or Star, they're sort of like an independent contractor. I don't exactly know what the terminology is. Is the government ready for sort of armies of people who don't have the kind of employment that traditionally we've had that they're used to?
I was just told a number that I have to go check for myself. So I haven't validated this number, but this person, an economist in New York, was telling me that today only 25% of working aged adults in the US have a job with benefits. And that is already an old thought that doesn't exist for most people. So we have spent, industrialization pushed us to have our social safety nets and our workplace rules tied to full-time labor, which is not the path that is actually happening today. So we need to restructure that, absolutely. So I think that is, for me, the really frightening potential of this future. And so I want to reiterate, everything that can become a platform is going to become one, because it's so compelling from the private sector point of view. So I have no doubts about that. So all labor is going to become this free-floating labor. When you talk to the freelancers union, they'll tell you that 50% of us will be independent by 2020. So we need, if I look out and think about people in the audience, it's something we really need to be focused on, because we are going to have the 0.001% and the 99.99%. We really have to address this issue.
Well, so what, and Karim, I want to hear your take on this too, but what does that mean to you? Okay, so we have all these people who are independent, but they still have needs. Does that mean the government's got to do better than they're doing at figuring out, all right, how do we restructure?
I'll say two words and I'll let Karim take, because he's going to go with this, I know. Where do we do what do we do with the productivity gains? And we're also definitely taking a lot of jobs out of the economy, and increasingly so. So a year ago, I timidly wrote, wow, I think we need a universal basic income. And then since this book has been published, and in recent press, it is being discussed around the world. So I think we do need to have a national health care and basic income that is a platform for participation in society. And I think there's definitely enough productivity gains out there and wealth out there to support that.
Yes, I mean, the topic of a national healthcare system or basic income, that's outside of my area of expertise. Because I don't study that, so I don't have much to say. I mean, I think there's some ethical and moral reasons above and beyond what's happening in the economy that we should be thinking about. But again, that's not what I study. I think the interesting thing is to sort of, the worry is that this kind of digitization, this kind of platformification, if you can use that word, is going to take out jobs, right? And if you sort of look at colleagues at MIT, Eric Bjornson and Andy McAfee, the whole second machine age perspective, sort of this, not only will you have platforms, then you have smart platforms and AI built into it, which will again take away a bunch of jobs. And I think probably the most compelling thinking about this question has come from Jim Besson over at BU, where he's looked at what happened in the Industrial Revolution here in Massachusetts, and what happened to all the milling machines, the mills that were here, and he says, look, there is a period of transition where there are job losses, and society needs to figure out how to deal with those job losses. But then it's a melding of sort of mind and machine that adds more productivity. And so when you read his analysis, and I believe his analysis, that you can actually be very optimistic. But there's a question of what happens in the transition. The new wrinkle, though, is machines were typically replacing manual labor. What's happening now, and this is the second machine age question, is machines are replacing cognitive labor. Right? The blue collar workers were being replaced in the first industrial revolution. The information revolution or the AI revolution is going to potentially replace
the hotel manager.
The hotel manager, or the surgeon, right, or the radiologist. And that, I think, is the interesting question for us. But
there's another piece, which is the pace. the pace of that transition
Absolutely. Yeah, so
is going to happen.
Yeah, the transition is going to happen.
Very, very fast.
Exactly.
Not in 25 years, but in 5 years.
Yeah, and we need, again, we need institutions that are flexible enough to recognize this and adjust with it. But I tend to be more on the optimistic side that we'll be able to do more as societies with the aids of these machines and with these platforms, as opposed to massive sort of unemployment happening in the economy. But we need readjustment, and we need to think about how our institutions, education, government, civil society, all of those work together on these things, instead of just saying.
It's so funny. It's exactly what you said, but I'd say it differently. I say we're going to see massive unemployment, and we need to cover it. And when we've covered it, we're going to see a blossoming of amazing innovation, because people aren't going to be, I feel like, what percent, I was reading that 40% of people are doing make work useless jobs right now and 87% of people are doing jobs they don't like right now, or have no passion for.
Professors do a lot of that anyway.
But so imagine, so covering this, I think we are going to see unemployment because it's going to happen so quickly. We haven't talked about autonomous cars at all, but it's going to happen very fast. And so we'll see this unemployment fast, but I do believe that if we cover people for this rock bottom place, we will see a blossoming of amazing innovations and passions and a totally different quality of life.
By the way, is there anybody who's tested out this idea of like a national basic income where you just, I guess, get money for
There's a bunch of
alive?
pilots that have only, because I admit, I'm like Karim, this is definitely not my area of expertise, and I'm having to like go scramble and do more. Someone just sent me one from India that was 6,000 people. They've done, I was in Finland, and the Prime Minister has promised to do several pilots within the next 2 years in his country. In Singapore, they're talking about it. So they're doing a pilot in Utrecht.
I mean, Social Security in many ways is
for older people.
Yeah, national basic income, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so we have elements of that in our economy.
Right.
Again, I don't know if our culture, if our political system, right, if our corporate system is ready to sort of absorb that, just given the mythologies and the ways of the way our country is set up,
Right.
the U.S. is set up.
Right.
But we have pieces of that.
Oh, last question right here.
Okay. I completely wholeheartedly agree with you, Robin, about the fact that we're heading towards this direction where everything is just going to be made more efficient through apps and other information systems. And I mean, just the other day, I ordered a bottle of scotch through Drizzly because I couldn't get it at my local store. I wanted to frequent my local store, but it just didn't efficiently provide me with the product I wanted, right? So my question is, obviously consumer preferences will change and things will change, but do you think that we will ever reach a point of saturation where there are just some things that cannot be replaced by technology in the shared economy?
Yes. I'm one of the things, if I think about the future of cities, and to this, so my thesis is there's this Peers Inc., the platform, and then the individuation. Well, it's my mind. It's in my mind. And it enables, I think, the best of both worlds. That we have had 100 years of industrialization, which was incredibly standardized and ripped out everything that was local and specialized and customized. And I think we're now entering the golden age of hyper-individualization, hyper-specialization, hyper-localization. And I think we can build that world. I mean, I'm going to Paris right now, and they did some...
In 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes.
They did this beautiful thing that they made these things called terroir, which was special geographies, so you could only get champagne from that particular. And if I look to this future, I think we will all be saying, wow, there's that really cool beer that you can only get, in this particular spot. Or my husband's going to be laughing that I use that example because I don't drink beer. But I do see that we'll be enjoying special cities and special locations and special regions will have their kind of music or their kinds of artists or their kind of thing. And I think we'll see more of that. So I see us going to a place where there's more distinction.
Yeah, I think as Robin said, I think what's happening is that what's interesting is that the local can plug into the platform.
Yeah.
Right, so what scotch did you get?
Oh, it was some French one. I don't remember.
Okay,
Yeah.
so like to get this fancy French scotch, right? I mean, like, it's typically not possible. So I think what's interesting is that these platforms will allow for this local to be plugged into the global and the international at the same time. But you know, I mean, I think we're, again, I'm fundamentally optimistic about this, and we're at the early days of this change going on. So it's historically consistent, but the scale is still early. And if you sort of think about the modern corporation, 150 years old, right? Which is you know, a rounding error in human history. But in 150 years, the modern corporations have created all this stuff. Like, all the stuff around us right now has been produced right from the buildings we're in, to the TVs we watch, to the channels that this is going to be on. It's all produced by modern corporations, which was an organizational technology. It was an organizational technology that allowed humans to extend its reach in amazing ways. I think we're really at the you know, the infancy of this platform world, right, and this distributed, shared world, and we're seeing a lot of experimentation. And I'm curious to sort of see where that takes us, and I'm fundamentally optimistic about what this holds for us going forward.
What I love is that as we come to the end of the discussion, you really agree, it seems like, on one thing, which is that things are really going to change. This is the beginning.
They are changing.
They are changing, and the pace of change will be rapid. And I think the sort of point of disagreement is the potential sort of massive unemployment, or what do you do if everybody's a freelancer? And then the other side of it, which is, it's okay, technology has changed before, and that argument about the mills, you know, you think about like the mills changing clothes. Well, it used to be partially that people didn't have very many clothes in their closet because cloth was the pain in the neck,
yes,
and expensive. And now, you know, we can buy clothes very cheap all
yes,
over the place, and so people decided, well, I can, you know,
get more clothes, right?
Exactly. So it's sort of,
even if you sort of think about, there's no more cloth production in the U.S. really, right? It's all gone to China, but the impact on China has been great because it's pulled out, you know, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty because that moved there. So I mean, I think we localize the effects here, and we don't think about how that's been absorbed over time, but we also think about the benefits of the fact that you know, I mean, there's also costs, of course, but the cloth production in China has, you know, pulled out a lot of people out of poverty as well. So I think
so
we
the
need to
place,
think about that.
you're gonna keep having more words after I've left. I think Karim and I agree 100%, except around pace. And so I'm going to Paris right now to be part of the climate change talks, and the pace at which we have to transform world economies is like something we've never seen before, and there's an extreme urgency to that. And so I don't see these things playing out. They're not going to play out slowly because the climate's not going to let us, and they're not going to play out slowly because we have big data and big machines, and we are able to do amazing things right now. So I see I see world economies at this. The pace of change is so fast that's why I think we need to cover this unemployment piece right away. And the other reason I want to cover that is legacy institutions and legacy ways of doing things, and the fear of job loss is this gigantic, I think, like a sea anchor that is just holding us back. And we have to change things out at a fast pace, and the anxiety of losing jobs, which is why the taxi drivers, of course, who wants to change and lose jobs? And the guys in the hotels. I mean, we're all afraid of job loss. And I'll still be afraid of job loss, but way less so. So we have to get these economies moving much faster.
Rob and Chase, run off to Paris now. Thank you so much. And as she goes, as she gets the red carpet out, I want to thank you so much for coming. I want to thank Karim Lakhani and Google and MIT Tech Review very much for organizing this. And if you have additional questions, Karim might hang around for a couple minutes. Thank you so much. This is great.
Thank you, Kara.
Thanks.
chosen to tell the tale in my own version. It was all